The smell hit Detective Joseph Kozinjak like a physical blow as he stepped through the front door of the modest ranch house on West Summerdale Avenue. December wind whipped through the Chicago suburbs, but inside the residence the air hung thick and putrid, a cocktail of decay and lime that made his eyes water. The homeowner, a stocky man with thinning hair and nervous eyes, hovered near the kitchen, wringing his hands as uniformed officers moved through the cramped living space. "I told you," the man kept repeating, his voice pitched higher than normal. "I don't know anything about that kid. Never seen him before in my life." But Kozinjak had been working missing persons long enough to recognize the particular brand of anxiety that came with guilt, and John Wayne Gacy reeked of it even more than his house reeked of death. The detective had arrived at this doorstep following a thin thread of evidence in the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast, a high school student who had vanished 3 days earlier after telling his mother he was going to see a contractor about a construction job. The boy had been scheduled to meet someone about potential work, and that someone had led investigators to this address, to this man who owned a small construction company and threw elaborate parties for the neighborhood children, complete with magic tricks and balloon animals. Gacy had seemed cooperative during initial questioning, almost eager to help, but there was something in his demeanor that set off every alarm bell in Kozinjak's experienced mind. The contractor's eyes darted constantly to the floor, to the walls, anywhere but to the detective's face, and his stories about that December evening kept shifting like sand in an hourglass. As forensics teams began their methodical examination of the property, Kozinjak found himself drawn to the basement, where the odor intensified to nearly unbearable levels. The concrete floor showed signs of recent disturbance, patches where the earth beneath seemed to have been excavated and refilled. Gacy's explanations for the smell ranged from sewer problems to dead rats, but the detective had encountered enough crime scenes to know the difference between routine decay and human decomposition. The homeowner followed the investigators around his property like a shadow, offering increasingly elaborate explanations for every suspicious detail they uncovered, his voice growing more strained with each passing hour. He spoke of plumbing issues that required extensive digging, of pest problems that had plagued the house for months, of contractor work that had left the basement in disarray. But his words tumbled over each other in a rush that betrayed his desperation to convince. The first body emerged from beneath the basement floor on December 21st, 3 days into what would become one of the most horrifying criminal investigations in American history. The remains were wrapped in plastic and buried in lime, a crude attempt at concealment that had only partially succeeded in masking the evidence of murder. As forensic specialists carefully excavated the grave, Gacy's composure finally cracked, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and barely contained panic. He claimed to have no knowledge of how the body had ended up beneath his house, suggesting that someone must have planted it there while he was away. But his protestations rang hollow against the mounting physical evidence that continued to surface with each shovelful of earth. The second body was discovered less than 3 feet from the first, then a third, then a fourth, until the basement began to resemble an archaeological dig site focused on the systematic unearthing of horror. Each new discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team, seasoned professionals who thought they had seen the worst that humanity could offer. The victims were young men, most in their teens and early 20s, their remains telling silent stories of violence and betrayal. Gacy's attempts at explanation became increasingly frantic as the body count rose, his narrative shifting from complete ignorance to vague suggestions that perhaps someone else had been using his property without his knowledge, that maybe former business partners or disgruntled employees had somehow managed to turn his basement into a clandestine graveyard. By the time the excavation expanded beyond the basement to include the backyard, the scope of the crimes had become clear to investigators, though the full magnitude would take weeks to comprehend. The property yielded 26 bodies from beneath the house and garage, with additional remains found buried around the yard. 3 more victims would eventually be linked to the case, their bodies recovered from local waterways where they had been discarded when burial space beneath the residence ran out. The methodical nature of the disposal suggested years of killing, a systematic approach to murder that spoke to calculation rather than passion, to a predator who had refined his methods through repetition and experience. The man responsible for this carnage presented a facade that was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. To his neighbors and business associates, John Wayne Gacy had been a pillar of the community, a successful contractor who employed dozens of young men and threw elaborate parties that were the highlight of the local social calendar. He performed as Pogo the Clown at children's birthday parties and charity events, his painted smile and colorful costume bringing joy to countless families throughout the Chicago area. The contrast between his public persona and the reality discovered beneath his house created a cognitive dissonance that law enforcement and the community struggled to process. How could someone who brought laughter to children be capable of such systematic brutality? How could a man who seemed to embody civic responsibility harbor such darkness beneath his cheerful exterior? The investigation revealed a pattern that stretched back years, possibly decades. Young men, many of them marginalized by society, homeless, or struggling with their identity, had crossed paths with Gacy and simply vanished. Some had worked for his construction company, others had met him at bars or through social connections, but all had fallen prey to his ability to present himself as a mentor, employer, or friend. The killer had exploited society's indifference to missing young men, particularly those from troubled backgrounds, understanding that their disappearances would generate less scrutiny than those of more privileged victims. He had counted on the invisibility of the marginalized, the way certain lives could slip away without creating ripples in the broader community. As detectives pieced together the timeline of murders, a chilling picture emerged of a predator who had operated in plain sight for years. Gacy's construction business provided the perfect cover for his activities, offering legitimate reasons to have young men at his property and explaining away the constant sounds of digging and construction that neighbors had noticed but dismissed as routine work. His involvement in local democratic politics and community organizations had given him a veneer of respectability that deflected suspicion, while his volunteer work as a clown had cemented his reputation as someone who cared about children and family. The very qualities that made him seem trustworthy had been carefully cultivated to conceal his true nature. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation painted a portrait of narcissism and manipulation that was as complex as it was terrifying. Those who knew Gacy described him as charming and persuasive, someone who could talk his way into or out of almost any situation. He had served a brief prison sentence in Iowa for sexual assault in the late 1960s, but had managed to rebuild his life and reputation after his release, convincing those around him that he had been rehabilitated and deserved a second chance. His ability to compartmentalize his existence, to maintain separate personas for different audiences, had allowed him to function as a respected member of society, while simultaneously pursuing a secret career as a serial killer. The victims, as their identities were slowly established through dental records and missing persons reports, represented a cross-section of American youth in the 1970s. Some were local teenagers who had been lured by promises of work or friendship. Others were young men passing through Chicago who had encountered Gacy during brief visits to the city. Many came from families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing sons, filing police reports that had been shuffled into filing cabinets and largely forgotten. The discovery of their remains brought both closure and fresh anguish, answers to questions that had haunted parents and siblings for years, coupled with the horrifying reality of how those loved ones had died. The legal proceedings that followed Gacy's arrest became a media spectacle that gripped the nation. The killer's bizarre behavior during interrogation and court appearances, alternating between claims of innocence and bizarre explanations involving multiple personalities and outside conspirators, provided a window into a mind that operated according to its own twisted logic. He maintained that he was the victim of a conspiracy, that he had been framed by enemies who had somehow managed to fill his property with corpses while he remained oblivious. His lawyers struggled to craft a defense for crimes that seemed to defy rational explanation, eventually settling on an insanity plea that portrayed their client as someone who had lost touch with reality. The trial revealed intimate details of how Gacy had lured his victims to his home, often under the pretense of offering them work or discussing business opportunities. Once isolated with his victims, he would incapacitate them through various means before subjecting them to sexual assault and murder. The systematic nature of his crimes, the careful disposal of bodies, and the elaborate steps he took to conceal his activities all argued against claims of insanity, suggesting instead a methodical killer who understood the consequences of his actions and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. The prosecution painted a picture of a predator who had spent years perfecting his technique, learning from experience to become more efficient at killing and concealment. The community where Gacy had lived and worked struggled to come to terms with the revelation that a monster had been hiding among them. Neighbors recalled the smell that had occasionally drifted from the property, the sound of machinery running at odd hours, the constant stream of young men who seemed to come and go from the house. Signs that in retrospect seemed obvious had been dismissed at the time as the normal byproducts of a busy construction business. The psychological impact on those who had considered Gacy a friend, who had attended his parties and trusted him with their children, created ripples of trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Law enforcement officials found themselves re-examining years of missing persons cases, wondering how many other victims might have crossed paths with the killer before he had settled into the routine that led to the basement graveyard. The investigation expanded to include multiple jurisdictions, as detectives attempted to trace Gacy's movements and activities over the previous decade. Some cases that had remained cold for years suddenly took on new significance, and families who had long given up hope of answers found themselves contacted by investigators asking about loved ones who had disappeared during periods when the killer had been active in their area. The psychological aftermath of the case extended beyond the immediate circle of victims and investigators. Mental health professionals struggled to understand how someone could maintain such a complete separation between their public and private selves, how a person capable of bringing joy to children could simultaneously be torturing and killing young men in his basement. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of evil, about how societies can better protect vulnerable populations, and about the warning signs that might help identify predators before they claim additional victims. As the legal process ground forward, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He painted pictures in his jail cell, many depicting himself as Pogo the Clown, and granted interviews to journalists and researchers who were trying to understand his motivation. His explanations for the crimes remained contradictory and self-serving, ranging from claims of complete innocence to suggestions that the victims had somehow deserved their fate. He showed no remorse for the families he had destroyed, instead focusing on his own suffering as someone who had been misunderstood and unfairly persecuted by law enforcement and the media. The trial concluded with a conviction on multiple counts of murder, and Gacy was sentenced to death for his crimes. The verdict brought a sense of justice to the families of his victims, but could never truly compensate for the years of anguish they had endured, wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The killer's execution, carried out more than a decade after his conviction, marked the end of a legal chapter, but could not erase the psychological scars left by his crimes, or answer all the questions that his case had raised about the nature of human evil. The house on West Summerdale Avenue was eventually demolished, its foundation and basement filled with concrete in an attempt to erase the physical reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. But the psychological impact of the Gacy case continued to reverberate through American culture, influencing everything from law enforcement training procedures to popular entertainment. The image of the killer clown became a lasting symbol of deception and hidden malevolence, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy and normal. In the decades that followed, the case continued to generate new revelations as investigators applied advancing forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected during the original investigation. Some victims who had remained unidentified were finally given names, providing closure to families who had never known what had happened to their missing relatives. The systematic nature of Gacy's crimes, the careful way he had selected and disposed of his victims, and the psychological profile that emerged from years of study became a template for understanding and investigating similar cases. The legacy of the Gacy investigation extended beyond its impact on criminal justice and popular culture. The case highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations, particularly young men who lacked strong family or community support systems. It demonstrated how predators could exploit society's blind spots, operating with impunity among populations whose disappearances generated little public attention or official concern. The systematic way that Gacy had targeted victims who were unlikely to be missed quickly became a cautionary example of how killers could exploit social inequalities to avoid detection. The investigation also revealed flaws in the missing persons reporting system that existed at the time, showing how cases could fall through jurisdictional cracks or be inadequately investigated when victims came from troubled backgrounds. The reforms that followed helped improve coordination between law enforcement agencies and created better protocols for investigating disappearances, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. The case became a catalyst for changes in how police approached missing persons cases, emphasizing the need to take every disappearance seriously, regardless of the victim's background or circumstances. As the years passed and the immediate shock of the discoveries faded, the Gacy case continued to fascinate and horrify new generations of observers. The sheer scale of the crimes, combined with the bizarre contrast between the killer's public persona and his private activities, created a narrative that seemed to embody the darkest aspects of American suburban life. The case served as a reminder that evil could hide behind the most mundane facades, that neighbors and community members might harbor secrets that defied imagination. The final tally of John Wayne Gacy's crimes stood at 33 confirmed murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But beyond the numbers lay a more complex story about vulnerability and predation, about how someone could exploit the trust and desperation of others to satisfy their own twisted desire. The young men who died in that basement had been sons, brothers, and friends, individuals with hopes and dreams, who had encountered someone who saw them only as objects to be used and discarded. Their memory serves as a reminder of the human cost of such evil, and of the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their circumstances for murderous ends. The case of the killer clown remains a watershed moment in the annals of American crime, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who work hardest to appear harmless and trustworthy. The painted smile that Gacy wore while entertaining children masked the face of someone capable of unimaginable cruelty, a deception so complete that it fooled an entire community for years. In the end, it was not the clown makeup or the party tricks that defined John Wayne Gacy, but the row of shallow graves beneath his house and the families left to mourn the young men who had trusted the wrong person at the wrong time, never to return home again.